If this bill proceeds, together with C-48, it will be a message to the people of Alberta that their federal government doesn't care about a devastating period of economic adversity in our province and is so careless about it that it's prepared to violate exclusive provincial jurisdiction. I plead with you as federalists to understand the national unity implications of it.
Okay, Jason Kenney brought his message and a warning to Ottawa today. This was his first face-to-face meeting with the Prime Minister since becoming Premier. Safe to say the two had a lot to talk about, but were they able to find any common ground, and what should we make of Kenney's strategy here? It's Thursday, and it's At Issue is here to dig into all this and more. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Andre Jomise joins us from Winnipeg tonight. Good to see everybody. I'll start with you, Chantal. What do you make of Jason Kenney's strategy today? This sort of warning that there's a constitutional challenge coming when it comes to Bill C-69, that there's a national unity crisis on the front burner if this continues.
3 points. The first, the election was 2 weeks ago. There would or might have been merit in letting more time elapse between the election and today, not because of any calendar-related issue, but because it allows one who has just won an election to move from campaign rhetoric to governmental rhetoric. The second point is, having covered a fair number of premiers from Quebec who came to Ottawa and pitched the same kind of message, there is also merit in not using your nuclear bomb or not showing what you think is a nuclear bomb on your first appearance, be it only because if things don't work out your way, you can't go back and use it again or say you're going to use it when you can't. And third, I would urge, I guess, Jason Kenney to resist the temptation of feeling in his comfort zone at the federal level, and he clearly does, and overdoing the federal-provincial thing at the expense of the governance thing.
All right, that's lots of stuff. Andrew, what did you make of him today?
I was a little more impressed that everybody seems to be agreeing to stay within the law, first of all. Everybody's suing each other, everybody's taking everybody to court. You know, we've got three provinces taking the feds to court over the carbon tax. We've got Alberta threatening court challenges over both C-48 and C-69. We've got BC challenging them over whether the feds can put a pipeline through without BC regulating, et cetera. But that's fine. That's at least staying within the bounds of the law. And I would also say within the bounds of some measure of political civility. So there was some rhetoric, but you know, people were urging the feds, for example, that they should just reject the Trans Mountain now to punish Alberta for electing Jason Kenney. They haven't done that. Kenney could have, I suppose, not just proclaimed Bill 12, the one allowing them to cut off the oil flow to BC, but he hasn't done that. He's not. He's saying he's not going to lift the cap on emissions, the 100 megaton cap on emissions, which is actually not actually in place. All that being said, people are kind of keeping their powder relatively dry, I think, compared to how much worse this could be at this point.
Okay, well, I want to come back to that. But Andre, what did you think of the way he sort of, you know, I mean, he gets a lot of attention, and he's a very good talker, and he makes his case forcefully, and he certainly did that today. What did you make of him? Well,
you actually hit the nail on the head there. The entire conversation right now at this point is just aesthetic. So it's not as if there's any sort of policy-oriented strategy happening here. What needs to happen for Jason Kenney is that he's seen to be blustering towards the Fed, and that he's seen to be defending Alberta's interests. Now, you know, whether any of this will amount to anything, if we're talking about Bill C-69 and the challenge to that, if we're talking about the threatening to turn off the taps, it's not as though there's anything driving this besides rallying Albertans behind the flag of oil interests. And frankly, it's at this point, it's kind of boring. Actually, it doesn't really stand for anything. There's nothing that we're going to see come out of this.
Except the people in Alberta would say that's, well, presumably that's what they think because they elected him, that's what they need, is someone who's willing to be not only a cheerleader but a defender and hopefully get to something.
Well, assuming that,
Go ahead, Andre.
I was going to say, assuming that there was a strategy behind this besides, again, rallying behind oil interests. You know, if we're talking about, for example, the attack on Bill C-69, what we're really talking about is the fact that Kenney and the UCP government do not want the public to have public consultations and possibly be able to find a way to veto some of these upcoming and proposed projects. But the very people that would be the most highly affected by any changes to their local environment, whether we're talking about fisheries or wildlife, et cetera, the people who are the most heavily affected and the environments that are most heavily affected, essentially he's saying that you don't get to have a say in this. The people who do get to have a say are either oil companies or the people who work for them.
Okay, Chantal?
I'm not convinced that that is really what he means. And I say this from the perspective of having watched various Quebec governments argue the same point, that is, that the province is well able to make that assessment and to take care of its own people without the federal government wading in to decide for Alberta what should or what should not happen. But I do agree that and that was my point about campaign rhetoric, it is hard to see real strategy behind it. I was struck by the reference to René Lévesque, the founder of the Parti québécois. And just a reminder for those who have forgotten, René Lévesque lost his biggest battles against someone called Trudeau.
That's a darn good reminder. Why don't you riff off that a little bit there, Andrew? Because I also, watching that national unity argument, whether it's real or not, it's still, I find it still worrying. You know, I just wonder whether that's a good avenue to go down for a country that has experienced what we've experienced.
So first of all, I think Albertans have every right to be extremely angry, upset, whatever word you like to use, at the state of play right now. That they are essentially being told by various sources that they cannot get their major export to market. They've got a federal government that, whether you agree with it or not, is bringing in basically a special tax on that product. They've got the federal government also saying you can't ship it by tanker off the coast of BC, though tankers are allowed to go off the Atlantic coast. You've got provinces on their right and on their left saying, we don't want your oil to come through our province, even though pipelines are a federal matter. So they're right to be perturbed about that. I don't particularly care for some of Mr. Kenney's answers. I think the federal government has to have a role in environmental policy when we're talking about a global problem like climate change. To say that that can just be handled by the provinces, I think is kind of parochial. Any more than I agree with BC saying the Fed shouldn't be able to put a pipeline through because we want to horn in on it and have a provincial responsibility for something that is quintessentially a federal matter, interprovincial pipeline. So the provinces will make provincial-minded arguments, but fair enough. They can take that to court, test it there, that's fine. Where I think he crosses the line is when he starts invoking a separatist threat. I, first of all, don't think it's actually real in Alberta. I don't think it's justified. But I also think, you know, you're playing with fire when you start throwing those words around at the federal level. That's not an appropriate way to make your case. You can absolutely talk about the justified grievances of Alberta, but I think when you start talking about the separatist word, that is not particularly responsible.
Andre?
Speaking to your comment, Andrew, about not being able to get the product out to market, Konrad Jakubuski actually wrote a very good article in the Globe and Mail recently, where it essentially illustrated the difference between, for example, a conventional oil extraction that happens to be, what's happening in, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which HSBC, turned down. Pretty much every possible means of meeting with the Kenney government and is now, I guess, flirting with the Saudi government. But this is conventional oil extraction. On the other hand, the bitumen extraction is not conventional and it poses the risk of becoming a stranded asset. This is not to pick on Alberta. This is just simply the way that the oil is extracted from this particular patch of land has an incredibly high environmental impact. And the globe is moving away from these means of production. So, it's unfortunate, and it's not as though I don't have any compassion for the people of Alberta, but unfortunately this method of oil extraction has a catastrophic impact on greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, last word to you, Chantal.
Well, you do realize all those court challenges will go all the way up to the Supreme Court if they do happen, and those that are happening. So we're not going to get any answers on any of those things until after the next election. And they could become moot if we change governments, and Andrew Scheer is serious about going back to the drawing board and drawing more laws that more people can challenge on you.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to do something unusual, but we're going to put everybody on pause, and we're going to do another round with At Issue after this short break. Stick around.
Today, we mark the 1-year anniversary since the leader of the federal Conservatives, Andrew Scheer, promised that he'd be releasing his plan to fight climate change shortly. Well, it's a year later, and we're still waiting.
Our plan, as I mentioned, will be unveiled with plenty of time for Canadians to analyze it, to evaluate it. But it has been quite some time since the Liberals promised their environmental plan, and today all we have is an ineffective carbon tax.
Recent floods in parts of eastern Canada have brought climate change back to the debate. I'm not sure it ever left, but it's in the forefront now. Lots of differences of opinions about how to handle this reality. We're back for another round of At Issue. Chantal, Andrew, and Andre. Andrew, let's start with you on this one. I thought, the flooding sort of is in everybody's face right now, particularly if you're going through it. And so I wonder if that makes you think about climate change more immediately and what you want to see from leaders when they decide how to deal with this issue, and whether that will factor into the election in a different way because of that.
I doubt it by the time the election comes around. First of all, I think there's some debate about whether this or that flood was actually the caused by global warming. But the general point of increasing incidence of extreme weather events is certainly well taken. And it's going to put it top of mind for some people for some time. But the election's not for several months from now. I suspect by then the number of people for whom the floods are driving their vote is going to be relatively small.
What do you think, Andre? I mean, this should be an issue that is nonpartisan in a way, climate change, and maybe it is, and it's just the policy approach that is different.
Well, the unfortunate thing is that I don't know that any of the major parties are taking a policy approach that's going to substantially address the problem. I agree with Andrew that I don't think it's going to necessarily be an election issue. I think that for most people, what's front of mind is their immediate economic circumstances. So whether they're able to find work, whether they're able to take care of families and so forth. But you just take a look around at what's happening. If you look at the statistics, I mean, the Insurance Bureau between 2008 and today has basically shown that the cost of each catastrophic weather event has practically quadrupled. So you can argue whether it's due to man-made climate change or not, but the fact is this is what's happening. And without policy set up to address that, I mean, this is just what we can expect for the immediate future.
Chantal?
No one expected refugees to become a huge issue or a conversation topic for a week in the last federal election until the body of a young child washed ashore. And if we'd been having an election campaign over the past few weeks, the weekend floods would have pushed climate change and changed the optics on everyone's policies, probably hurt the Conservatives tremendously. And they were given a sample of that over the weekend. I'm sure the floods by next fall, or I hope, will be a thing of the past, but there is no guarantee that there will not be some other catastrophic climate event that will not propel it to the front. And I think every party, but in particular the Conservatives, have to think about how they're framing their policy so that they don't get caught as they got caught on the refugee issue.
Last word to you on that, Andrew.
Yeah, I think this is one of those issues where parties try to neutralize it. So if the Conservatives have any kind of political savvy, which I think they do, they will at least have it something they can talk about, something they can say, this is our plan. Whether it's an adequate plan, I think many people will have a lot of things to say about that. But for electoral purposes, they have to have something they can point to and say, this is our plan.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everybody, for doing 2 blocks. I appreciate that. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. Lots this week. We're going to talk about a little more on the same topic, latest round of those tensions between Alberta and BC. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.